Hey, how are you guys doing? It's been about a week since we had a video class, but I thought it was probably time to get another one going for us. So we've talked mostly about all of the stuff that goes on internally, or all of those mechanical components of an engine that are internal. Today we're going to talk about and identify some of those things that are external on the engine block and cylinder heads. So we'll go through a few of those, and then later in the week I will have a video that I will do of each component that's laid out and ask you to identify that. So pay attention today. Here we go. Let's take a look and see what we can find here. Okay, so the first things that we want to take a look at here as we look at the front of the motor are a couple of things. This component down here, this is our harmonic balancer, and you'll notice this, you can't tell on the video, but this ring right here is a big rubber ring. So this outer metal pulley has a rubber ring that attaches it to the center hub of the harmonic balancer. And this is bolted to the crankshaft. Okay? This component here is, the black part is the pulley that the belt runs around, but it is attached to this component here, which is the water pump. And most water pumps are attached to the front of a motor, most of them. Okay? This component right behind it, we've talked a little bit about this previously with timing chains, and this component here that the water pump is mounted to is the timing cover. So underneath this cover is where our timing chain and gears is. This is a V8 OHV motor, overhead valve. So the camshaft is in the engine block, and usually in those situations, the timing components will be timing chains rather than timing belts. If we look on this side, this component here, this part, is just a bracket that is going to hold, in this case, the alternator would mount right here where these mounting points are here. So these are idler pulleys. An idler pulley is the pulley that just guides the belt and helps route it. This pulley here is what we call our tensioner pulley. It actually is spring loaded and can rotate, and therefore will put tension on the belt. So that's the difference between the two. You can see that this pulley spins free and is just mounted all by itself, but down here that this pulley is mounted on a tensioner type assembly. So this is just an accessory bracket that holds the alternator. If we look at the top of the motor, this is a fuel injected motor, by the way. And so here we have, let me go to this side. This component, this black piece here, is the upper plenum. I know that sometimes you hear intake manifolds, but the actual term for this particular component here is the upper plenum. Bolted to the upper plenum is our throttle body. You'll notice that here is where the throttle cable, or when you push down on the gas pedal, that it opens this throttle assembly, and you can see inside here that when you push down on it, that throttle plate opens and closes inside the throttle body. So this is a throttle body. Our upper plenum, or upper intake manifold, then is bolted to a lower intake manifold, and that's this assembly here. Okay, this component down in here. You can see the mounting bolts right here and right there. Those are the mounting bolts for the lower intake manifold. Okay, so typically it's an upper plenum and a lower manifold. Those are the intake. We also note here that these components here, this, and there's one up further up here behind this, here it is here, there, those are our fuel injectors. And you can see that the fuel injector goes into, down here, goes into the intake manifold, the lower intake manifold, and is connected to this metal piece along here. which is the fuel rail. So our injectors go into the lower intake manifold and are supplied with fuel through a fuel rail. You can see a little cap right here. That's like a valve cap on a tire, and that is access to check fuel pressures in fuel rails, because fuel pressure is pretty important to the operation of the engine. This component that is also attached to the fuel rail right here, you can see that there's a hose port and threading right here for the fuel line to attach here to get fuel into the fuel rail. And this is a vacuum line, and this component is a fuel pressure regulator. Fuel pressure regulator attached to the fuel rail where the injectors are to regulate the fuel pressure. Also attached to the lower intake manifold is this component here. And you guys can see, and many of you are familiar with it, it looks like a thermostat housing, and the other end looks like it's an end where the radiator hose would attach. And that's exactly right. That's exactly what that is. And if you remember, as we go back or think back to our cooling system lessons, you remember the coolant flows into the bottom of the engine block. You'll notice here it flows in through the water pump, travels through the engine block, circulates through that, and then would need to come out through the thermostat, and then it would come out of this hose and go to the upper radiator, upper portion of the radiator. So that's what this component is. This is the thermostat housing. Thermostat housing is that component. Now we'll move to the side of the motor. You guys, most of you know that this cover right here is the valve cover, and it bolts on top of the cylinder head and covers up the rocker arms and the push rods and the tops of the valves and the valve springs. All of that is underneath the valve cover. The valve cover bolts to the top of the cylinder head. You can see that our cylinder head is here, where you see these spark plugs are screwed in. Okay, again, our valve cover is bolted to our cylinder head. And the cylinder head then is bolted to the engine block, which is down here. Okay, so this is a cylinder head, spark plugs, and then this component here is our exhaust manifold. So in other words, it is where the exhaust leaves the cylinders, travels through the exhaust manifold, and then exits out the back of the exhaust manifold. Okay, so that's exhaust manifold. You all know as well that this is the oil pan. This is where all the oil obviously is stored, where the drain plugs are at for us to drain the oil, and so on and so forth. There are some other individual components on the engine that vary from engine to engine. This little port right here is a heater hose port that would go to the heater core to supply hot coolant for the heater assembly. This component is an electrical component. You can see, excuse me, you can see that it's got a plug-in. That's a temperature sensor. It bolts right in to the intake manifold, and you can tell that it's in an area where the coolant would be. The hot coolant, here's a heater hose, and obviously right next to it would logically tell you that that's probably a coolant temperature switch, and that's what that is. It's also, you notice, directly above the thermostat housing. So again, that would indicate to you that it's probably a temperature sensor. Down here, this black component that is here on the side of the engine block, here's our engine block assembly. This component is a crankshaft sensor. So we've talked about the crankshaft and the rotations, and the computer has to be able to tell when the crankshaft is rotating to help know when to spark the spark plug and when to fire the injectors or to send fuel to the cylinder. And so that's what this is. You can see back here on the crankshaft that there are teeth or triggers. I call this an exciter that sends a signal each time one of these small little ridges passes by this sensor. It sends a signal through this connector here to the computer so that the computer knows when to fire the injectors and what position the pistons are in. So that's another sensor that we will find on all engines designed and developed today. They're just in different locations. Some of them are on the front around the crankshaft pulley and the harmonic balancer. Some of them are mounted in the side of the engine block and actually are triggered off an exciter that's connected to the crankshaft internally. A couple other quick things that we want to talk about, and that'll finish up our video for today. These plugs here, you'll find these on all engine assemblies, okay, and on some of the engine videos that you've looked at. These are expansion plugs is what these are called, and these go in. These are plugging up big holes in the side of the engine block. There's two reasons for those. One of them, the reason for these big holes is to help with manufacturing, to help the molten metal when they cast the engine blocks to allow air to escape and to allow access to different areas in the manufacturing process. In addition, what it does is these go into the cooling system, and therefore if for some reason the water or the coolant in the engine did not have adequate protection, the water would freeze. Water expands, and expanding, the ice would expand, or the water, frozen water would expand and is strong enough to crack the engine blocks. And so manufacturers utilize these, that these plugs would actually pop out to relieve the pressure and hopefully save the engine block from breaking. And then the last component we're going to talk about is this component right here. This is an oil filter housing assembly. This is where obviously the oil filter bolts to the engine block. I'm sorry, where the oil filter is attached to the engine assembly, and that oil filter housing is bolted to the engine block right there. That is a big Allen head bolt or screw attachment fastener that holds this oil filter housing to the engine block. So those are our component IDs for the external components of an engine. You will find all of these components on all motors regardless of manufacturer and make. It's just that they will be located or designed and look just a little bit different, but they are all necessary parts of the engine. So go ahead and fill out that worksheet that I put together with this video, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Hey, don't forget to stay clean and stay safe, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.